At 34, my life had become a meticulously crafted masterpiece. From my sleek glass tower apartment in Sky Lake City, where the city lights stretched like scattered diamonds beneath me, I gazed at a horizon free of financial burdens. Last year, selling my tech startup for $5 million had promised an endless vista of comfort. No debts, no demands, just pure possibility. $5 million in the bank, no wife, no kids. By every measure, it was the pinnacle of perfection. I'm Adam Bennett, by the way, a tech entrepreneur from Coastalwood. Yet every sunrise brought with it a single, unyielding shadow. My father, Edward Bennett. He was the persistent, inky stain on the otherwise pristine canvas of my newfound freedom, a silent, dissonant chord in a symphony of peace. Edward was once a prominent real estate businessman, but after a series of audacious, then disastrous real estate gambles that crumbled like dry earth beneath his feet, leaving behind a bitter dust cloud of resentment, he became bitter and controlling. Not controlling my life, but controlling my wallet. His presence was like a subtle, suffocating gas, seeping into every corner of my life, primarily through the threads of my finances. In his eyes, I was merely an extension of his ledger, a walking ATM rather than a son of flesh and blood. Before I dive deeper into my story, what would you do if you had a father like that? Let me know down below. And if you think this kangaroo is cute, leave a like. It genuinely helps motivate me to keep sharing pieces of my life with you. This morning, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the dark emerald green dress shirt that my mother Eleanor loved. A relic of happier times, it felt oddly stiff against my skin, its color meant to evoke growth but instead mirroring the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. A faint, comforting scent of Eleanor's laundry detergent clung to the fabric, a small anchor. Today is her birthday, and as usual, the whole family will gather at the old house in the suburbs of Coastalwood. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the heavy feeling that always comes when I think about facing my father. The man who, in all my life, has never hugged me, never asked if I was okay, and only ever looked at me as if I were a walking safe. In truth, that's still far kinder than how he treated me when I was a child. He was an alcoholic, and whenever he was drunk, he would drag me from my small, unlit room, the cold floor biting at my bare feet, and his blows would rain down, not in anger, but with a chilling, detached precision. The bruises faded, but the echoes of his laughter, a cruel, mocking sound, carved themselves into my very bones, forming invisible scars that throbbed with a phantom ache whenever his shadow fell upon me. Those memories are etched into me like scars that never heal, and every time I face him, those scars bleed again. I drove my Obsidian X7 smoothly along the scenic coastal roads, sunlight dappling through ancient redwood trees that stood like silent, solemn sentinels. The distant murmur of the Pacific, a constant, restless sigh against the shore, filled the air. I turned on the radio. A nostalgic jazz tune played, but its melody struggled to quiet the cacophony of fear and resentment clashing within me, a discordant symphony of unresolved pasts. When I pulled up in front of the familiar two-story wooden house, Eleanor was already standing at the door, her smile as radiant as the sun. "Adam, you're here!" she exclaimed, her voice a melody of relief, hugging me tightly. Her embrace was a soft, enveloping cloud, carrying the familiar soothing scent of lavender and honeysuckle, a balm to the raw wounds within my spirit. The party took place in the backyard garden. Usually a quiet sanctuary, it hummed with a delicate vibrancy. Paper lanterns painted with intricate floral patterns cast a warm amber glow, chasing away the creeping dusk. The air vibrated with a medley of joyful chatter, the tinkling of ice in glasses and the smooth, melancholic strains of a saxophone weaving through the general merriment. Eleanor, at 60, was the center of everyone's attention. She still exuded elegance, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her brown eyes sparkling with gentleness. I looked at her silently, grateful that no matter how the world turned upside down, my mother remained my anchor. Edward, as usual, stood in a corner of the garden, a glass of red wine in hand, his cold gaze sweeping over the crowd. He was a statue carved from shadow and ice, his presence radiating a chill that seemed to seep into the very warmth of the celebration. He wore a gray suit, still looking distinguished, but his smile, a thin, almost predatory curve that didn't reach his eyes, always sent a chill down my spine. A peculiar habit, almost a nervous tic, was how he'd subtly tap the rim of his wine glass with his thumb when observing someone, a sound no one else seemed to notice but me. A tiny clink that always signaled his predatory focus. I tried to avoid him, focusing on chatting with Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Leo, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes following my every step. "Adam," Edward's voice rang out as I was grabbing some cake from the buffet table. I turned around to see him approaching, a glass of shimmering red wine in his hand. "Have a drink with your father, son. A special glass just for you." He emphasized the word special, his smirk making me uneasy. The wine shimmered in the crystal glass, a deep, unsettling ruby hue, almost too vibrant, like a drop of fresh blood caught in the light. A primal alarm shrieked in my mind, a frantic, unheard clamor against the polite facade I had to maintain. My fingers tightened around the stem, a desperate grip against an unseen current. "Thank you, Father," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Eleanor was nearby, laughing with Aunt Beatrice, and I didn't want to do anything to worry her. I raised the glass and took a sip. The wine was rich, slightly bitter, but nothing seemed unusual. I looked at Edward. He nodded as if he had just completed a task. Just a few minutes later, my head began to spin. The garden, a moment ago so vibrant, began to spin, blurring into a kaleidoscope of indistinct shapes and fading colors. The laughter of guests transformed into a distorted, distant echo, like voices heard through a thick, watery veil. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat struggling for a rhythm, and a suffocating tightness seized my lungs as if the very air was being sucked from the space around me, leaving me gasping for an invisible breath. "Mom," I whispered, trying to walk toward her, but my legs, once pillars of strength, became rebellious things of rubber, betraying my desperate command to reach for Eleanor. I stumbled, the wine glass falling to the grass and shattering. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the old bed in the upstairs bedroom. The familiar, slightly musty scent of the old house's upstairs bedroom filled my nostrils. My head throbbed. My body felt drained of all strength. Eleanor sat beside me, her hands, usually so steady, clutching mine with a white-knuckled desperation, her face a crumpled landscape of fear and relief, her eyes red and swollen. "Adam, are you okay?" "Oh God, I was so scared." Her voice trembled as if she had just lived through a nightmare. "What happened?" I mumbled, trying to piece things together. The image of the wine glass, Edward's smile, and the dizziness came rushing back like a wave. I looked at Eleanor, searching for answers in her eyes, but she only shook her head, stroking my hair the way she did when I was a child. "You passed out in the garden. Your father said you drank too much, but I know you didn't. You only had one glass, didn't you?" She looked at me, her eyes full of worry. I nodded, my throat dry. One glass, just one glass of wine from my father. I held Eleanor's hand, feeling her fingers tremble slightly. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I wanted to say something to reassure her, but I was drowning in a sea of doubt myself. That glass of wine, Edward's cold smile, and the sensation of being drained of life, all were pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet fit together. "Adam, I'm so worried," Eleanor said, her voice softening as if afraid someone outside might hear. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden where I had collapsed. "What you went through," The dizziness, the shortness of breath, losing consciousness. I've seen it before. It was just like my father. I froze, my heart pounding. "Grandfather?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I had only met him a few times as a child, a tall man with a booming laugh, but Eleanor had told me he died suddenly when she was young. "A heart attack," she had said. She turned back to me, her eyes red, her hands clasped tightly as if to keep herself from falling apart. Yes, my father collapsed like that too after an evening of drinking with Edward. His name was Arthur. He was healthy, Adam, just like you. No illnesses, no warning signs. But the next morning he didn't wake up. Her voice, usually so steady, now trembled like a fragile leaf caught in a strong wind, each word pulled from a deep, hidden well of old grief. I remember the smell of fresh-cut grass and rain on the night it happened. And then the chilling silence that fell over the house. It wasn't natural. I stood and walked to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, I don't think it was an illness." I hesitated, unsure whether to voice the suspicion screaming in my head. But her eyes, filled with both fear and hope, compelled me to speak. "I get regular checkups, you know that. My heart, my blood, everything's normal, no signs of any hereditary conditions." She looked at me, her eyes widening as if she had just realized something horrific. "Then, what do you think happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, feeling as though I were standing on the edge of an abyss. "Mom, I think there was something wrong with the glass of wine Dad gave me." The words spilled out and I saw her step back, her hand covering her mouth, her face paling. "Adam, what are you saying? Edward is your father." Her voice was filled with pain, but I caught a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But didn't you notice he kept emphasizing that the glass was a special?" I drank it and then I collapsed. "I wasn't drunk, Mom. I only took one sip." I paused, looking directly into her eyes. "You thought it was strange too, didn't you? Dad said I drank too much, but you know the truth." Eleanor sank into a chair, her trembling hands clutching a cold cup of tea. She was silent, but I could see the struggle within her, between her love for Edward and her maternal instincts. I don't want to believe it," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's true, I did find it odd. Your father insisted you were drunk, but I looked at you and I knew you weren't." We sat there in silence, like two weary travelers lost in a storm. I took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Mom, I'll find out what happened. I don't want to suspect Dad, but I need to know the truth." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Be careful, Adam. If you're right, I won't let anyone hurt you." As I left the house, I felt both relieved and weighed down. My mother believed me, at least in part, but the suspicion about my father, even as a mere thought, was like a crack in the foundation of our family. I drove home, my resolve burning fiercely. I would uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. After the conversation with Eleanor, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, each step trembling. The weight of suspicion, a suffocating shroud, clung to me day and night. Sleep offered no escape, only a parade of distorted images. Edward's empty eyes, the ruby glint of the wine, the phantom taste of a betrayal that had almost claimed my life. Was I descending into madness, or had I truly stared death in the face offered by the hand of my own father? But I knew I couldn't stop. I needed the truth, even if it tore our family apart. Thanksgiving arrived, bringing with it the biting cold of November. Eleanor called, her voice gentle but filled with hope. "Adam, come home for dinner, will you? Just one evening." I wanted to refuse, to stay far away from the house now shrouded in darkness, but I couldn't bear to disappoint her. "I'll come," I said, though my heart felt heavy as lead. The old house under the biting November dusk seemed to hold its breath, casting long, skeletal shadows. The windows, usually welcoming, now glowed with a faint, uneasy light, like eyes watching from a hidden depth. I stepped inside. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air, but it did nothing to warm me. Eleanor hugged me, her smile still radiant, but I saw the worry hidden in her eyes. Edward sat at the head of the dining table, a glass of red wine in hand, his gray suit impeccably pressed. He looked at me, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Adam, are you feeling all right after that fall in the garden?" His voice was even, but I could hear the mockery in it. I sat across from him, forcing a calm expression. "I'm fine, Father, thank you." But my hands clenched under the table, my nails digging into my palms. Eleanor bustled about, bringing out dishes, her chatter with Aunt Beatrice filling the air, but my focus was solely on Edward. His gaze followed me like a predator stalking its prey. When the main course was served, Edward stood, raising his glass. "To family, to Thanksgiving," he said, his eyes locked on mine. He handed me a glass of red wine, its color glinting under the candlelight like fresh blood. "Drink, Adam. This one's special." The word special rang out, identical to the night of Eleanor's birthday. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming no. I wouldn't let it happen again. I took the glass, my fingers trembling slightly. Eleanor was in the kitchen fetching dessert. Edward watched me, his gaze challenging. In that moment, I knew I had to act. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, each beat echoing the frantic calculations in my mind. As I stooped to retrieve the fallen napkin, a whisper of a movement, a mere blur of my hand, replaced his half-full glass with mine. The crystal clinked softly, a sound that only I seemed to hear, a tiny bell tolling for a truth about to be unearthed. I sat up straight, my heart pounding like a drum, sweat, cold and clammy, trickled down my spine, but my resolve solidified, hard and unyielding as granite. Edward raised his glass, took a large sip, then turned to talk to Uncle Leo. I gripped his glass, now mine, but didn't drink. I waited, watching. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, nothing. I started to think I was paranoid. But then about 45 minutes later, Edward stopped mid-sentence. His face, moments ago composed, slackened, a pale canvas upon which fear began to bloom. He clutched his chest, his breathing labored, his grip on the glass loosened, his fingers going white before it slipped, shattering on the polished floor like a fragile secret exposed. "Edward, what's wrong?" Eleanor cried, rushing to his side. Eleanor's gasp, a sharp, ragged sound, pierced the sudden silence. He staggered, then clutched his head, his face ashen, and collapsed. Eleanor's scream tore through the air. The dining table erupted into chaos, Aunt Beatrice calling for an ambulance. I shot to my feet, but not out of fear, because a horrifying truth was dawning on me. Dizziness, shortness of breath, fainting. Just like me on Eleanor's birthday, just like my grandfather Arthur, as Eleanor had described. "Call an ambulance now," I shouted, but my eyes stayed fixed on Edward. He lay on the floor, his breathing faint, his glassy eyes staring at me. In that moment, I saw a flicker of panic in his gaze, as if he knew what he had just drunk. The ambulance arrived and the paramedics took him away. Eleanor sobbed, clutching my hand. "Adam, what's happening?" "Why is this happening?" I hugged her, but my mind was reeling. If I hadn't swapped the glasses, I would be the one lying there. The thought hit me like a knife. "Mom, I need to take a sample of the wine from that glass," I whispered. She looked at me, her eyes filled with horror, but she nodded. I knew she was thinking what I was thinking. When everyone left, I quietly collected a sample of the wine left in my father's glass, the one meant for me. I poured it into a small vial and tucked it into my pocket. That night, I didn't sleep. The image of Edward collapsing, his empty eyes and the ruby red wine haunted me. I was right. My father had tried to kill me, and now I would prove it. The days following Thanksgiving, I lived like a fugitive, not fleeing from someone else, but from my own thoughts. The weight of suspicion, a suffocating shroud, clung to me day and night. Sleep offered no escape, only a parade of distorted images. Edward's empty eyes, the ruby glint of the wine, the phantom taste of a betrayal that had almost claimed my life. Was I descending into madness, or had I truly stared death in the face offered by the hand of my own father? But I knew I couldn't stop. I needed the truth, even if it tore our family apart. I contacted a private laboratory in Coastalwood, a discreet place I'd heard about from friends in the tech industry. I didn't dare send the wine sample through the mail, too risky. Instead, I drove there, the vial tucked in my coat pocket like a tiny bomb. The lab was a sterile, hushed sanctuary smelling faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. The technician, a middle-aged woman with kind, weary eyes behind thick spectacles, handled the vial with a reverence that acknowledged its deadly potential. "I need it tested for anything unusual," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "As fast as possible." She nodded, asking no questions. 3 days, she said. Those 3 days felt like 3 years. I returned to my apartment, locked the door, and drew the curtains as if afraid Edward might appear at any moment. Eleanor called, her voice frail. "Adam, your father's doing better. The hospital said he went into shock, but they couldn't find a cause. Do you know anything?" I heard the doubt in her voice, but I didn't dare tell her. "I'm looking into it, Mom. Don't worry." But I was the one dying inside from worry. On the 3rd day, my phone rang. It was the technician. "Mr. Bennett, we have the results. You should come in." Her voice was cold, professional, but I sensed the gravity behind it. I raced to the lab, my heart pounding. She handed me a report pointing to a bolded line. "Barbiturate, high concentration." "It's a sedative," she explained. "This dose was enough to cause unconsciousness, even death, if not treated in time." I stood frozen, the paper trembling in my hand. Barbiturate. The word barbiturate stood out in bold black print, a brand on the page, scorching the very air. Not alcohol, not drunkenness, not illness. Someone had deliberately put poison in my glass of wine, and I knew who. The world tilted on its axis, but my mind strangely cleared. I looked at the technician, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Thank you. Don't tell anyone about this." She nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. On the drive back, I circled the city, my mind reeling. Edward, the man who raised me, the man I had once tried to please despite his coldness. Why? Then I remembered my wealth, $5 million, no wife, no children. If I died, my father was the legal heir. The truth hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole my breath. He didn't just want to control me, he wanted me gone. My existence, my success, was a barrier to his desperation. The cold calculus of inheritance, clean and brutal, painted a terrifying portrait of his intent. I parked by the bay, watching the waves crash against the rocks. The cold wind blew, but I felt nothing except the anger burning inside me. My father had tried to kill me not once, but twice. And if I hadn't swapped the glasses on Thanksgiving, I wouldn't be standing here. I gripped the report tightly, resolute. I would confront him, not for revenge, but so that Eleanor and I could be free. Edward was discharged from the hospital a week later. He looked like a desiccated husk, the once sharp angles of his face softened by illness. Yet his eyes, those cold, calculating pools, still held a dangerous glint like shattered shards of ice. Eleanor wanted me to visit, but I knew this wasn't an ordinary visit. I brought the lab report, tucked in my coat pocket like a protective talisman. As I stepped into the old house, I saw Eleanor in the kitchen preparing tea. "Adam, you're here." She smiled, but I saw the sadness in her eyes. Your father's in the living room. I nodded, took a deep breath, and walked in. Edward was seated in an armchair, a glass of wine again, in his hand. He looked at me, that familiar smirk curling his lips. "Adam, come to visit your old man. That's good of you." His voice, usually a command, was now a fragile thread, barely masking the weariness beneath. He tried to project his usual aura of effortless authority, but it was a thin veneer, easily shattered. "I need to talk to you privately," I said, my voice firm. Eleanor was in the kitchen, out of earshot. He raised an eyebrow, gesturing for me to sit. I didn't. Instead, I pulled out the lab report and placed it on the table in front of him. "Barbiturate," I said, staring into his eyes. "In the wine you gave me on Thanksgiving. Enough to kill. Explain." His face stiffened, but he quickly regained his composure. "What are you talking about, Adam? Poison? You've lost your mind?" He laughed, but the laugh was forced, unable to mask the panic in his eyes. "Don't lie," I said, my voice cold as stone. "I swapped the glasses with you. That's why you collapsed, not me. I have proof. The lab confirmed it. If you don't tell the truth, I'm taking this to the police." Silence. Only the ticking of the clock and Edward's heavy breathing filled the room. Then, like a wall crumbling, his shoulders slumped, the rigid posture of years collapsing. His hands covered his face. "Adam, forgive me," he rasped, the words tearing from his throat, each one heavy with a desperation I had never witnessed. I only meant to knock you out. I was going to forge a will, take your money. I'm in too much debt, Adam. I had no way out. I thought I could make it all disappear, reset the board. You were the last piece of the puzzle. I just meant to put you to sleep. Just long enough to create a new reality." I stood there looking at the man who was once my father, now just a desperate shell. His confession cut like a knife, but strangely, I didn't feel anger, only sadness, deep and heavy. "Why, Dad?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I'm your son." He didn't answer, only bowed his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. I thought of Eleanor, of the years she spent living with a man like him. I wanted to call the police, to make him pay, but I knew it would destroy her. "I won't go to the police," I said, my voice trembling. "But from now on, stay away from me and don't ever touch Mom." I turned and walked away, leaving him in the cold room. As I stepped out, I saw Eleanor standing at the kitchen door, her hands gripping the frame, her face pale. Her whispered "Adam" was a sound of unspeakable pain, a shattered sigh. I froze. She had heard it all, the confrontation, my father's confession, everything. I walked to her, wrapping her in a hug, feeling her tremble in my arms. "Mom, I'm sorry," she whispered, as if she were the one at fault. "I never imagined Edward could..." I led her to the garden where the lantern still glowed faintly from her birthday. We sat on the wooden bench, the silence broken only by the rustle of the wind through the trees. I held her hand, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she took a deep breath, her voice steadier. "Adam, I heard everything, what your father said. I can't believe it, but there's something I need to tell you." She looked at me, her eyes filled with both pain and resolve. "The symptoms you had on my birthday, they were exactly like my father Arthur's. He collapsed too after an evening of drinking with Edward." She paused, as if summoning the courage to continue. "My father died soon after. Everyone said it was a heart attack, but I always found it strange. He was healthy, no illnesses, and after he died, Edward inherited nearly all of my family's wealth." I felt my blood run cold. "You suspect Dad was involved in Grandpa Arthur's death?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't want to think it, Adam. I loved your father. I wanted to believe in him, but now I'm afraid I've been living with a monster." Her words were like a cold wind stripping away any remaining illusions. I hugged her tighter, feeling her pain merge with mine. "Mom, if you're right, we need to find the truth," I said, my voice firm. "Not just for me, but for Grandpa Arthur and for you." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I'll help you, Adam. No matter what happens, I want to know the truth." We sat there under the dim moonlight, mother and son now allies in a battle neither of us could have foreseen. I knew the road ahead would be painful, but I was no longer afraid. With my mother by my side, I was ready to face anything. The day after, Eleanor and I began our quest for the truth. We didn't talk much, only acted like two soldiers in a silent battle. I suggested starting with the safe in Edward's study where he kept important documents. The study, Edward's domain, felt heavy with unspoken secrets. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale ambition. Eleanor agreed, though I saw her tremble as she opened the door to that room. "I haven't been in here in a long time," she said softly. Edward didn't like me touching his things. The safe sat in the corner, a cold block of steel. Eleanor remembered the code, their wedding date, a detail that stung my heart. Inside, we found real estate papers, contracts, and an old, worn, leather-bound notebook. "This was my father's journal," Eleanor whispered, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. The scrolled handwriting of my grandfather Arthur emerged, chronicling his final days. Nested beneath layers of legal documents like a hidden heart was a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. My grandfather's elegant looping script filling the pages, a voice from beyond the grave. One entry, dated just days before his death, ripped through the quiet like a gunshot. "Edward's behavior grows unsettling. Last night, after a glass of his special blend, I felt a peculiar weakness, a fog descending. If anything befalls me, know that I suspect foul play. Investigate Edward, protect Eleanor." Eleanor and I looked at each other, speechless. My grandfather's words, like a message from the past, confirmed our fears. "Mom, we need experts," I said. I contacted a private investigator, Mr. Sterling, who had helped a friend in a lawsuit. I also called a lawyer, Ms. Anya Sharma, who specialized in criminal cases. Both agreed to meet with us. Mr. Sterling suggested exhuming my grandfather's autopsy report. If there was poison, traces could still be found, even after all these years, might, he said. With Ms. Anya Sharma's help, we obtained a court order. The exhumation was a grim, somber affair, a dance with the past under a leaden sky. But the results, they were a cold, unyielding hammer blow. The autopsy report, now re-examined, revealed that my grandfather Arthur had been poisoned with a sedative closely related to barbiturate. Not a heart attack, not natural causes, not God's will, a deliberate, insidious hand. We dug deeper. Mr. Sterling uncovered forged documents in Edward's inheritance records, mismatched signatures, irregular transfer agreements. Each piece of evidence was a brick building a wall of guilt around my father. Eleanor sat beside me, reading each document, her face growing harder. "I lived with him for over 30 years, she said, her voice breaking. "I knew nothing, Adam." I took her hand. "It's not your fault. He deceived us both." But I saw a fire in her eyes, not grief but determination. Her face, once etched with the quiet pain of a lifetime, now held a fierce, unyielding resolve. 30 years, she whispered, her voice like splintered glass. "I lived with a ghost, but no more. He will pay. For my father. For you." She was no longer the submissive wife. She was a mother, a daughter seeking justice. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'll sue him," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Not just for you, but for my father. Edward has to pay." I had never seen her so strong. We prepared everything with Ms. Anya Sharma and Mr. Sterling. The file was thick, the lab report on the wine, my grandfather's journal, the autopsy report, and the forged documents. Each page was a knife into Edward's past. The trial took place on a gray, rainy day. The courtroom was a sterile, oppressive space, the air thick with tension, the whispers of justice, and the unspoken weight of a shattered family. Rain lashed against the windows, a mournful drumbeat accompanying the grim proceedings. I sat beside Eleanor, holding her hand, feeling her icy fingers. Edward stood in the dock, a shadow of the imposing figure he once was, no longer the powerful man I once knew. He looked aged, his eyes hollow, his once sharp gaze dulled like a broken mirror reflecting only emptiness, but he still tried to deny the charges. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice weak. But the evidence was undeniable. Ms. Anya Sharma laid out every detail: the wine laced with barbiturate, the intent to kill me, my grandfather Arthur's journal, the autopsy report, and the forged documents proving Edward had poisoned my grandfather to seize the family's wealth. The prosecutor called Eleanor to the witness stand. She stood tall, a beacon of quiet strength. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the tense silence, painting a vivid portrait of years of subtle manipulation, of a love poisoned by greed, and the devastating revelation of a father's betrayal. I watched her, my heart swelling with pride mixed with sorrow. Edward had no chance. The jury took only 2 hours to reach a verdict: guilty. Attempted murder for me, and first-degree murder for my grandfather. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As the police led him away, he turned to look at Eleanor and me, his eyes empty. No sense of triumph bloomed within me, only a hollow ache, a profound sadness for the family that had once been, now reduced to fragments and ashes. After the trial, Eleanor moved in with me in Coastalwood. Our new home in Coastalwood was smaller, filled with sunlight and the sweet, gentle fragrance of the lavender Eleanor now cultivated in the garden, a symbol of healing and renewal. The old house was sold, a way for us to close the door on the past. Eleanor found peace, free from Edward's manipulation. She started gardening, tending to lavender blooms, and every afternoon we sat drinking tea, talking about simple things. I looked at her, seeing her smile return, though tinged with lingering sadness. "Are you okay, Mom?" I asked one day as the sunset bathed the garden in gold. She nodded, squeezing my hand. "I'm okay, Adam. Justice has been served, my father can rest in peace, and you're safe. That's all I need." I found peace too, though the scars from my father would never fully heal. They were etched deep, but they no longer bled. They were a reminder of the darkness we had faced and the light we had found together. I continued my work, but now I lived for my mother, for the simple moments we shared under the sunset's glow. I knew we had emerged from the darkness together, so tell me, did I go too far sending my own father to prison after all he did? Or was it the only justice left for me and my mother? Share your thoughts down below. I'd really love to hear who you think truly deserved their fate.